Hey, can you hear me?
Hi, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make, this is Cathy.
Hi, Cathy. I know you're the instructor. I've taken a class with you before, and it's awesome to see you again.
Yeah.
Are we going to be waiting for a couple of minutes for other people? I was just.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Okay.
yeah. I just, okay. Wow. Just trying to figure out if I know how this works. Hey, Kevin.
Hey, Cathy.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm really good. My kids wanted new beds. I said, fine, go find a plan. And I put my order in at Home Depot and pulled up, and the guy's like, what are you doing? Because to save money, you know, like I bought like 1x6s so I could make my own 1x2s and 1x3s, and you know, so teaching them that, you know, what those really mean, and watching Allie like rip boards down, and she had a little trouble with the measuring tape being upside down. It was pretty funny. I'm standing there, I'm like 37.5 inches. And she's like at 23 or something. And I'm like, no. But then she was reading the feet, and yeah, it was just, you know, but I'll tell you, you know, she's quick. Once,
Yeah.
you know, C1, once she's got it down, man, she was just, you know, ripping the boards. And so she decided that Matt wants like this ultimate gaming studio. And so he's 14, almost 15. And so he has these loft designs. So she's going to build his bed first, because her bed incorporates herringbone cuts and, you know,
A little more complicated.
Yeah.
Well, in a couple minutes, I need to pull my dinner off the stove, but I don't feel like you have to wait on me.
You mean you're not having reheated pizza?
No, it's all about other adult foods like hot dogs.
Oh, okay. Good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Pizza's just a work food.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure throughout this I will be interrupted by what's for dinner. So
That's all right.
you're big people. Rusty is scary though, man. He's got some. He's got some like really sharp. This thing that's like it'd be like a scathe. You know, like when they used to like whack down wheat by hand, but it's got a
Like a scythe?
Yeah, it's got a really long blade on it, and then he's built the handle, and he pounds it to the top of the wood to split it. But what he uses to pound it in with are two different logs, where he's then cut down part of the log so he can get it around his hand. And one of them's so heavy, he has to, like, while it's down, like get it rocking and rolling, swinging it back and forth, and then he finally swings it up in the air and it comes down. And he's saying to me, "Oh, just hold the log." And I'm like, Rusty? Yeah, And his wife came out and she's just laughing, just like, oh, you found a sucker who will, you know, do this with you. I'm like, I don't know about that, but.
Good old Rusty.
Oh, man.
He's a unique one.
But it was really neat to get to use like the spoke shave and, you know, like, if you get a chance to go over there, you should.
All right.
I mean, it's like, you know, he has drying stuff and then, you know, steam stuff, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, smoke shave's on my list of tools to acquire.
Yeah.
All right, but I'll be back in just a second.
Cathy, is this your studio?
No, on the picture, yeah.
Yeah.
The picture that is, yeah. Because cutting boards take so long, what I did is I was actually building a gift for somebody, and it's a very heavy, it's a 2-inch thick.
Wow, looks it.
Walnut and maple checkerboard. And then once the studio opens back up, I will be able to use the CNC to make the checkers, because he's a sommelier, and he gives me wine crates to build furniture with.
Where does he get the wine crates from?
Well, he's a sommelier. He's the sommelier for the Buckhead Dining Club.
They have access to wine crates?
Yeah, because he's a sommelier. I mean, that's what he does for a living. He buys and distributes wine. So he has, and so every once in a while, in to me, what's like the middle of the night, because you know he works at the Buckhead Dining Club. So it'll be like 1 in the morning, and he'll leave them on my front porch.
Wow.
And so he just bought a house up in LJ, and so the checkers for this checkerboard on one side will be grapes, and on the other side will be wine bottles, and they'll be also made out of the maple and the walnut when they're done. So, but I do have some pieces from a true cutting board that I'm in the process of building, that if we get to it at the end. So I did not take pictures. There's actually Purple Heart, walnut, hard maple, and cherry. And I cut them all to 3/8 of an inch thick, and then ran them through my drum sander until they were 0.001 away, plus or minus at 0.25. And I finished the first glue up. I did the first glue up yesterday, and I cut them today. And I have 4 of them that are not in today's glue up, and I'll show you what I'm going to do with these. I mean, yeah, a cutting board like this really requires a drum sander to get, because each piece has to, when you see what the cutting board looks like, each piece, the thickness of each piece really, really matters. Like when I make my optical illusion cutting boards, the smallest piece has to be 0.4 millimeter or 4 millimeters thick, and then the next two have to be 5 millimeters thick, and you can really only get that with a drum sander. And I found one on Craigslist. So
this checkerboard's possible only using a drum sander?
Oh no, the checkerboard is, we can build the checkerboard at Makers. That, I mean, if you took the cutting board making class with me, you could build this board. Most people choose to build a little bit more complicated boards, and I posted a couple of pictures of some boards I recently made and said, you know, hey, who's ready for, you know, the next level of cutting board?
I
Yeah.
haven't done level 1 cutting board, so I'd love to do that whenever,
Mhm.
you know, whenever you're offering it. I did see it offered.
It
It
It-
must have been a while ago that it was offered.
It was, well, the first one was in January, I believe, and it was on Tuesday nights. And
So
then no, I'm sorry, on Saturdays.
Okay.
On Saturdays. And then the next one, we only got 2 weeks into it before the shutdown, and it was actually either Monday or Tuesday in the
If you
morning.
offer it, definitely sign up.
Yeah, you just have to let me know, you know, like, I mean, how I normally do it is 1 day a week. You know, I mean, I
Okay.
could do it 4 days in 1 week, but so far nobody's wanted to do that. You do have to, the reason it has to go day by day, and you'll see in the demonstration that you have to go overnight. So
Okay.
yeah. So it's like almost 7:10, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So
Okay.
basically what this is a picture of I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, I'm assuming you can, but so there are 2 pieces of walnut and there's 1 piece of maple, and they're both roughly, well, they're both, at this point, they are now 2 inches thick and they're about 27 inches long. I buy my lumber rough cut, meaning that it's not square and it doesn't look like this, because it's much cheaper this way too. And then at home, I have a joiner and a planer, and I can make it. I make 3 sides, so the bottom and the top, the 2 face sides, and then 1 edge. Those are, the bottom and top are parallel to each other, and the 1 edge is perpendicular. So these were actually pieces from, some of the pieces from the last class. So then what I did on my table saw, which is just like the one at Makers, is since the board was already 2 inches tall, I cut all the boards 2 inches wide. Okay. Because I wanted a square. And I cut them all at the same time. So that way there's no trying to you're never going to be able to reset the saw. I mean, you can try, but you know, when we're doing cutting boards, when I'm doing cutting boards, I plan out all my cuts. So all my 1.5 inch cuts get done at the same time. If I'm doing angled cuts at various angles, all those cuts get done at the same time. Nothing gets altered, so that, you know, if it's wrong, I can still work around it, but they're all wrong the same way.
Yeah.
So that's what makes it so easy. So at this point, you can see, you know, just 4 of the pieces of the maple and the walnut, and you can see in the walnut that there's a big knot. Now, realizing that this is just a checkerboard, I didn't have to worry about the knot. If this had been a cutting board, I would have had to come up with a solution of probably epoxy or sawdust, or not using this area of the board, because that needs to be completely closed so you don't get bacteria in it. So since this is just a checkerboard, I just went ahead and didn't worry about it. So here you are at, basically, you're ready for the first glue up. And so, yeah, it's every other one. And on the leftmost side is your maple, on the rightmost side is your walnut, and they're all the same height. So they're all the same height, they're all the same width, because they all got cut at the same time.
And what height did you keep them to? Like
They're 2 inches. So it's 2 inches by 2 inches.
Okay.
So that's the standard checkerboard. You know, it's kind of, you know, like when you go to make one, it's 2 inches by 2 inches. Yeah. So what I do after that, once I've picked, and so what you do is you sort of play with the boards, and I probably should have put a picture in of of this board on the other side. Eventually you'll see it, but I go through and you know, I can use either side of the face grain. I usually don't mix like face grain and edge grain. You can if you want. You can't mix anything with end grain. If you mix with end grain on cutting boards or because the wood is going to expand and contract in now 4 different directions, it's going to crack. You know, no matter what, it's eventually going to crack. So you can see these white lines, and that's just a chalk pencil. And why I do that is usually when I'm making something like this, I'm making, oh, I don't know, 6, 10, 12. And so I go through and I'm moving boards around, and I'm picking which side, and I'm picking if, you know, if the board is going to be used on both sides, or if the board's only going to be used, like in this case, only on one side. You know, I'm making the decision of what the pieces are going to look like. And I have these stacked all over the place. So I use a different pattern on each cutting board. And that's so if I drop the pieces or I knock them off something, all I got to do is put the puzzle back together, and there's the cutting board. It's back to where it was. It's back to what I decided. I can just move on. So it's just used for memory. And I do it every time. So what I've done now is the red right here are 2 of my clamps, and they are actually sitting on top of 4x4s, which is sitting on a piece of wood that's covered in shipping tape, because wood glue does not touch shipping tape. This piece of wood right here, there's actually two of them, and they have shipping tape on them as well, and they're going to be used for calls. So I have these 2 set up, and then I have calls for both sides set up, and I have my clamps for the calls for both sides set up. Like, it's kind of like going to surgery. Like, if you come to my class, people think I'm sort of crazy, but then they, like, when they get to their second glue up, they're like, okay, I got everything. I got them set almost to the right size, because you're using Titebond 3 glue, and Titebond 3 glue is sets faster than Titebond 2. So you don't have a lot of working time, especially like when you see the pieces that I made yesterday. I think I used a half a gallon of glue, and I just unscrewed the top and literally poured it on the pieces, because they were 5 inches wide, and I was pouring glue on 24-inch pieces, so 20 by 24 I was trying to cover with glue. So this is what it looks like when I've just squeezed it on. And that's what you're trying to get to. Okay, if it's less opaque than this, you don't have enough glue. If it's darker than this, you're going to have a lot of glue squeeze out, and it's going to be harder to take care of. Now, if you look, the first piece is already set and doesn't have any glue on it. And then all the other pieces were picked up and rotated clockwise, so that when I pick them up now, I'm going to rotate each piece toward, so I only put glue on one face. So the first piece stays up. The rest of the pieces, in this case, for this cutting board, I could really, really easily do all the glue at one time. When you're working like with, when I'm doing like scrap boards or much more complicated boards, sometimes I even have to do glue ups. Like pieces have to get glued up in a different kind of clamp for a day. And so then the other rule I follow religiously is when you cut wood, you're releasing tension. And when you release the tension in the wood wants to change shape. So I cut and glue the same day. If I am not going to glue that piece that day, it doesn't get cut. So it's just, that's how it works. And that's how it works. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, you can just try it. Just, you know, cut a piece of wood, let it sit overnight and go see if it's still straight the next day, and it won't be. So now you can see my pattern's back. I have it in the two big Bessie clamps. You can see this piece is the caul that is, and you can sort of see the glow of the tape. This piece is going to go on the bottom. This piece is taped side down, and it's going to go on the top. So when I set these up on the 4x4, why I do that is to give myself enough room to install the cauls really, really easily. So they're all lined, because the reason you use cauls is if you don't, when you squeeze it together, in a sense, from left to right, you know, there's that glue, and there's a lot of glue. And so the boards want to get away from all the pressure. And so they will, if you leave it overnight, when you come back, it won't be flat. The pieces will have moved up to get away from the pressure. So you have to keep it down with the cauls. So in there you can see, I put on enough pressure that you can see the glue, okay? So here, that's not good. That says not enough glue. This is what you're looking for, this thin little line of squeeze out. Here, there's not a thin little line. Here, there was too much glue, so it's a thicker line. So here, it's not well, it could be too. In my case, at this point, I may not have enough pressure on it yet, but when you're done with pressure, this is what you want, this little line of bumps. And there is sort of an art to it, you know, like when I teach the class, you know, I'll tell you, you know, that's it, and it's usually that it's not enough glue. People are like, oh, I don't need that much glue. And it's like, no, yeah, you do. You need, you need twice that amount of glue. So now I've put the cauls on. So what I do is with the cauls, I use a hand clamp, one hand clamp. And so I can pick it up. I get one on each side, and then I usually use, depending on the length of the board, like in this board, I'll use 3 on each side. Once I get, I don't, at this point, the red ones are resistant to movement, meaning they you know, are putting some pressure on the wood, obviously, because I'm getting glue squeeze out, but they are not cranked all the way down. If I tried to crank them all the way down, I wouldn't be able to put the cauls on and make them flat because there'd be too much pressure. They would have already moved. So if you get them too tight, the nice thing about this, if you have everything laid out, then you can quickly go back the pressure off, get the cauls on, and get everything level again. So here it is. So now all the cauls are on, all the clamps for the cauls are on, and they're tightened down to as tight as they can be. So they're at their final point, and now I'm starting to tighten, and you can see there's more glue up here. I'm starting to tighten the red clamps. Then what I do for, you know, in this size board, okay, it depends on the size of the board, how wide the board is. This size board, I only needed 3, so I take a 3rd long clamp and I put it on top. So it's also putting pressure down, but it's also giving me pressure left to right. I mean, there are instances where I will have calls right in here because there's so much space. It just depends on the size, but typically, you know, we're going for like a 12, the typical cutting board size is like 12 by 18. And I like to keep people initially only going 12 inches wide so we can use the DeWalt planer because it's so much better than the big 27-inch planer. So at this point, it's basically done for the day. If I had flipped, you know, usually your calls may be a little bit shorter, or you can run them all in one direction, so I could stand it up on end. And that's what I usually do is I pick it up and stand it up on end and leave it overnight. I leave everything overnight for as much. I mean, there are times when I just, it's hard, but I know that it'll be totally dry if I leave it overnight. So this is the next day. And so you can see, what I did do was I came back about a half an hour after this picture, and this glue had started to dry. And so I took basically a little piece of plastic and I scraped the glue off. And the reason I did that was to make it easier. It makes it less work at this point when you take it out, because you have to cut it again, but everything has to be smooth to be able to cut again. So I've taken it out. Here's my glue. This is a carbide scraper that's used by painters. And the blade is very sharp. And I use that to literally just like scrape the paint off. I mean, scrape the paint off, scrape the glue off. So you can see here, this glue is from the clamp, but I want to get as much of this glue off as I possibly can. Now, if the cutting board is not perfectly flat at this point, you can hand sand it. You can hand sand it with a belt sander. For this kind of board, you can use the planer. For an end grain board, it's not as good an idea, but there is a trick for end grain that I've successfully used. But you can see this is the back of that piece that has the little crack on the front, so it has a big hole in the back. So, you know, that's why, you know, I went ahead and left the piece in. I really like the wood movement, and it's only a checkerboard. So these were the spots where I couldn't, you know, they were underneath the clamps, so I couldn't get them off with scraper. Here's another kind of scraper. You can just use a putty knife, and I just literally sharpen the edge of a really flexible putty knife with a comfortable handle, and you can just zip it down and get rid of it. You can see the lines are still there. You can see where the glue went further. You can see here where I've used the scraper, and it's starting to take the little bubbles off. And here's what they look like. So, yeah, that's what it looks like. So now I've totally cleaned it all up. Okay, so the board is clean, but when I was gluing it up, the boards shifted a little bit left to right, just a tiny bit. I mean, if you look at this opening is the opening for my blade. And you can see, look, here there's some blade, but up here it's all the way. Now, this is my crosscut sled. It's within 0.001 degrees of being perfectly 90 degrees. So I know that because this edge is straight, that I'm cutting perpendicular to that edge. And I only, because remember I'm making a checkerboard and I really don't, I should have put in a couple of extra rows so I could just basically throw them away at this point, because it is now slightly not perfect 2x2s, but I was like, well, too late to think about that now. So what I do here is I trim this so that these extra pieces, so that it's all straight. For those of you who are wondering why this says crosscut sled dado, my crosscut sled, I can take this piece out and I can run a dado set in there without having to make another crosscut sled. So that's, and I do bring it to makers when I do the class, because I know it's 90 degrees. I just find it kind of ironic because it's much harder to push at makers, yet we have the same saw, but somehow the tracks are just a little bit different. So you can see here on the other side where it's much, you can see where they moved. So this side has now been cut. And then basically I'm just gonna flip it over because I wanna still reference this bottom piece. I don't wanna go reference the top piece. I wanna keep it all relative, just in case. So when I cut the other side, this is basically what I was left with. So not much, you know, not even, you know, worth saving for another project. But now it's all squared up. So what I did next was I set a stop block into my crosscut sled. So now I'm going to be cutting across this, and I want all of these pieces to be identical in width. I want them all to be the 2 inches in width. So what I did was I put the stop block in, I measured, I took some scrap. I always run scrap through to make sure I'm getting exactly what width I want, because, you know, so much better to screw up with scrap than, you know, to cut your first chunk of your board and then say to yourself, oh, it's too big or too small or whatever. So I just clamped on basically part of a 2x4 that obviously had some massive notes on it that means something, I don't know. So that's what it looks like. Oh, this is how I test, this is what I did when I tested it. So then when I cut it off and tested it, okay, what I wanted was, so this is flat, all right? I want the height of the cut, so I'm making squares. So I wanted this to match that. I wanted to make sure that that was the same size. And if you really can't tell, but it was off by a little bit. And so I did have to alter the placement of this, and I use something called a Pfeiler, so I can measure that height, the height difference I had here, and it was like 0.02. So I have these little sticks that I can use, and I basically put 0.02 here, and I put a piece behind it that stayed in place, pulled those out shifted this over, and then I knew I would be perfect, but I did check, I did test it. So now I'm starting to cut the pieces, and I go ahead and number my pieces as I cut them. The reason I do that is I may or may not want the grain pattern to show up when I'm putting the cutting board together. But if I don't number the pieces, then I have to figure it out by myself. If I do number the pieces, then I can put them all back together in the exact same grain pattern and have that. So it's just a matter of, you know, what am I gonna do? So yeah, so that's why, once again, the 1, the 2, you know. So they're all stacked up, and there's number 8. And so now when I line them all back up, you can see basically the grain go up. And these are the 2 4x4s that I use. I forget what I made. I made something, and these were left over, and now they've obviously been substantially destroyed in my shop. But yeah, so now you can see the grain pattern is all there. But now, okay, what all I did literally was rotate, but I left the same grain pattern up. I didn't turn any of them over. So this piece goes with this piece, which goes with this piece, which goes with this piece. So it gives a story, and you'd be really surprised that how relaxing this is to the eye, to the human eye, to be able to see the pattern. And you can see here, number 8 hasn't been turned yet. So this is, you know, and I'm looking at these points, you know, because I am a little off here because of having to cut the edges. But I had never really tried for, in a sense, like the perfect checkerboard. You know, I usually do, like, I make really weird cuts and stuff, so they still match up, but they don't have to be perfect. So there it is with 8, and I don't know. Okay, so then just for fun. So this is if I turned it up so that it was on the end grain. So this is what an end grain board would look like. And this is where I really like it, because you can see the tree, the lines of the tree. You can see it go. And I was kind of bummed, like, ooh, I should have made an end grain, but you can also see, you know, now there is the 2 pieces from the knot. But it was fun just to see what it would have looked like had I made an end grain board. End grain boards are great. They're the best kind of cutting boards to make because the end grain fibers open and close when the knife hits it. So the knife doesn't get dulled and the grains close, so the board doesn't show knife marks. So for this, I make boards for chefs of Atlanta restaurants, and they have to be end grain. They, you know, it's all there is to it. So this is basically the quote bottom, if you want to think about it that way, of the checkerboard. So see, in the bottom is where I have the big hole that you can see here, you know, where something happened in the maple. So I made a decision when I was laying out the pieces in the beginning that this would end up on the bottom. And I know it's a lot of math, and it's a lot of, like, you're like, oh my God, how would I ever remember this? And that's why it's good to, like, do it with somebody, because, you know, they can ask you. Then you start talking to yourself like I do. But yeah, so that's the bottom kind of, or that's the end. So here is the end grain, and here is the face grain. So you can see the huge difference in how the board would look, one versus the other. So now we're getting, or I'm to the point where, okay, so I'm setting up for the second glue up, okay? So I have my Titebond 3. I only use Titebond 3 for cutting boards because it's food safe and waterproof, both. I use a wicked expensive roller here that I get from any business supply store for like $4 until the rubber rots off. You know, I have my cawls, I have my clamps, I have these two in place. I have them close enough together so that I have this overlap on the side so I can get the cawls on. So I'm ready to go. And then at my feet, I actually have the third big clamp. So it's once again, you know, it's sort of, I don't know, like surgery or something. And I always do it the same way because that way I'm not panicked that I don't have something or I can't find something because I don't know. I have a tendency to lose things. So what I've done is I've set the clamps so that they're almost shut for the final width when it is glued up. So there's the cawls. You can see the tape, see the 3 clamps, see the thing protecting my my saw table. But see, when I turn them, when I rotate them clockwise, because they're taller, they don't all fit. So I put the last 2 out here. So I'm only gonna do the glue initially on these. I might have actually poured the glue on all of them, but you know, sometimes you run out of space. So, you know, you have to put them out to the side, but you wanna put them in the order they're gonna be in. So yeah, so I just did the first 5. Poured the glue on. I knew I was gonna need extra glue here because it was gonna run through the hole. And I didn't have enough glue. So that was, this part this time wasn't nearly as dark or nearly as blocked out as it was on the first one. So I needed to add another piece of glue. The other thing too is I'm now pouring glue on end grain. So end grain, you know, if you think about where the fibers are, the end grain is actually sucking the glue into itself. So you do have to put more glue on end grain than you do on face or edge grain. And then after I got all those pieces done, then I brought my other 2, glued them, put them in, and now I'm back to doing the cawls. And you can see a little bit of glue squeeze out. Do the cawls on the other side. Now I've got all of my cawls on. Hey, buddy.
Oh.
No, we have a puppy, and yeah, I know your ears hurt. Say the big dogs are pulling me around by my ears. Say hi. Say hi. That's Miley. She's going back to college with one of my kids in the fall. So, yep. So here you can see the glue squeeze out. It's fairly linear. You know, not too bad. And then now I've dropped in the third. I used another Bessie clamp instead of a pipe clamp. It was just whatever was within reach. Once again, it's overnight. It has to go overnight. So here it is when it came out, and I hand sanded it. You can see there's little errors here and here. But overall, I was fairly happy with it. So this has been sanded. The first sanding it gets is 80 grit. So we go 80, 120, 150, and then 220, but we'll talk about that in a second. So at this point, the board's been sanded all the way to 180, and it feels really nice. But the grain itself wants to pop when it comes in contact with liquid. So if I sanded it to 220 and went upstairs and put it in a mineral bath, I would end up with a rough board. So what I do is I spray it with water. So this is without water. That's what it looks like with water. So I just spray it down with water. And that also gives you an idea of what the board, so without and with, what the board's gonna look like. And I let it sit just like this overnight, and what happens is all the grain pops up. So when you had felt the board at 180, when you come in the next day and touch the board, you almost wanna say to me, I gotta go back to 80 because it's so rough. But it's not really that bad. It's because the little grains have popped up. So we just take the 220 to it, and then it's totally perfectly smooth. And when it goes in the mineral bath, it's not going to pop at all because it's already popped and been cut off. So once again, this is why we're into day 3 already, because you have to let these things go overnight. So there's the 220. And that's what it looked like at the end of 220. And all I did was I didn't, it's not a cutting board, so I didn't put handles in it, like cut grooves in it with a router. I didn't chamfer the edges. I rounded them just a tiny bit because it's actually going to sit in this a cherry box that has a drawer in it. And this is going to sit in the top and be held in the top. And then the drawer will hold the checkers. So that's what it looks like. Okay, I'm done. At this point is, and I didn't show it, is when I brand all of my products, and I would have branded this side because this will be the downside. Some people would put it on, they put theirs on the edge. It's just, whatever personal preference it is, but that's when I mark the board. So this is my oiling bath, and most people don't have this. Most people wouldn't waste having tubs of mineral oil, but because I do this so often, I do. And so what most people would do at this point is basically squirt mineral oil out of a bottle, rub it in, put a glove on your hand, rub it into the board, let it sit up on 2 boards overnight. What I do is a tub full of mineral oil. I put it in here, and you can actually see right here bubbles. So that's telling me, that's not fully sealed. If it were a cutting board, I would worry, but this is just a checkerboard, so I don't worry. There's some right here as well. And in this case, since I was seeing bubbles, I left it in there until there were no more bubbles coming out, because then that told me that the mineral oil had gone through all the cracks. And then what I do is I literally pick it out of this board, and then I go right to the right, and this is like a kind of like a drip dry board. So I stand it up in this bin, and then I can at the end pour the mineral oil back into the first container. So and then it sits like this overnight, and then I do it again overnight. And then the last thing I do is I do it by hand, which is a mineral oil and beeswax mixture, 50-50. And I do that with it sitting on with the tarp underneath it, sitting up on a couple of, and then I let it sit. I wipe it on and let it sit overnight. The reason I use the beeswax is most of my stuff is gifts. If I don't use the beeswax, they need to be re-oiled. They either need to be covered in plastic or re-oiled within 2 months. If I use the beeswax, I don't have to do anything to them for 2 months. And I usually, when I give them as gifts, I give a little itty bitty bottle that has the mineral oil beeswax combination in it. And I give an instruction piece showing, reminding people that they have to oil the board once a month. And if they don't, it's gonna crack. I promise it's gonna crack. And not to let water sit on it, don't put it in the dishwasher, just, a little bit of soap and water and then dry it off. And I have all that on a card so that whomever's getting this, they know how to take care of it. And you can even use baby oil, because baby oil is mineral oil. I just buy gallon jugs. Like I bought 5 gallons a couple of years ago and haven't run out yet. But that's a really basic, like, fly through, this is how you make a cutting board.
Cathy, how do you melt the beeswax to add it to the mineral oil? You
can, or you can buy it already prepared. And I just buy it already prepared.
Oh, so it's already a mix, like it's available in the market as a mix.
You can get it at Ace Hardware, you can get it on Amazon,
Okay.
Yes, I made a 2-inch thick solid walnut end grain board for my sister, and she did not take care of it and has a crack in it, and she won't give it back to me to repair. And her husband has told her that the crack is going to break the board. So I was just like, oh, whatever.
How would you repair it? Would you put sawdust and epoxy in it?
Oh no, it's way beyond that. The crack is fairly substantial. So what I would do is I would route what's called bow ties or maybe arcs in the cutting board itself. And then I would want to go with a contrasting wood. I'm sure she would want me to do it with walnut, route out the piece to fit in. So basically, if you think about the way the bow tie is, then as the wood is trying to pull open, it has to get wider and wider, so it doesn't want to pull. Same thing with an arc, to try to flare out the arc's ends. I've done some really nice ones with just a series of arcs. I really like that, but most people really like bow ties. I've done butterflies. But anything that has that sort of triangular shape where you're getting wider, so that the crack really would have to fight that wood to open up anymore. So I was going to show you guys, if you would like to see it. I'm working on a board that I'm really excited about because I've always wanted to do it and I've never had the time.
Love to see it.
This is the first glue up of the board. Okay, so this is 16 pieces. There's 4 Purple Heart, 4 maple, 4 walnut, and 4 cherry. I cut them over here on my bandsaw. I sliced them down to 3/8 of an inch. And then I ran them through my drum sander until they were all 1/4 of an inch plus or minus 0.001. So basically they're all the same height. Now they're glued up in such a way that they're in 4 sections. So here it is, you can see, the glue up, you can see the squeeze out. because that is, I mean, if you think about it, this is 5 inches wide and this is 24 inches long. So that it took a lot of glue. Here's the glue bottle, and it does not even have the lid on it because it took too long to squeeze it out. I just literally poured it out. So then today, there's 4 sets that are in the same order of the Purple Heart, the maple, the walnut, and the cherry. And this is normally what is called a tapering jig, and you set this piece at an angle and you can taper a piece of wood. Well, what I'm using it for instead is, you know, these pieces slipped a tiny bit and there's glue squeeze out. So I want to make this edge perfectly straight. So it's barely hanging over the edge of the jig, and then these 2 handles hold this board down, and these 2 pieces hold down the 4 pieces of wood, and I can just zip it through my table saw and it creates a smooth edge. So there's what they look like after the 4 have been, and I only have to do one side. I can leave the other side alone. I only need one straight side. And it'll make sense in a minute as to why. So when I measured them, so, you know, it should have been exactly 1 inch, yet, you know, 1/32 of an inch now has been added to all of them because of the glue and the wetness. So I measured the thickness to make sure that they were all the same thickness. And then what I did was the same trick as before. I used the other end of my caliper and set my saw blade to be 1 inch and 1/32. And I ran a test piece through to see how close I was, you know, until I got just the right setting. And then I ran, this was the first piece I cut. So now what has happened is, because I cut it the same thickness as the height, this is all one surface. So this is what it looked like when I was done cutting all 4 pieces. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4. But this is when the magic starts. So now, because they're the same width and same height, I can get vertical and horizontal stripes. So this is all in glue up right now. And that what's going to happen tomorrow is this edge is going to get cut off, and these are going to get cut at 1.5 inches and stood up. So it's going to be an end-grain board where the pieces will go from vertical to horizontal. So it's a board I've always wanted to make and just have never had time to make it, and decided during Corona, why not? But you know, it's not that hard. I mean, you can buy wood that's already at 1/4 inch, and you know, and when the board is done, people are absolutely amazed at what it looks like. You know, it's like, but once you figure out, you know, like how it was done, it's like, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. So like, this isn't actually a cutting board. This is a cutting board turned into a knife block.
Oh, wow.
And that's made out of scraps. So, you know, that's actually, it looks really, really hard, but once you learn how to do it, you're like, oh, well, that's really, really easy. Yeah, that's that one.
Have you made any of them with scrap?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The chaos boards are, that's what they're called, chaos boards. Chaos boards are one of the biggest selling boards that I have, and they sell for the highest price. I also use them for auctions because they do so well. Now, if you look at this board, you would say to me, I can't make this board. You'd be like, no way. But that's because of how you're looking at it. If you look at it this way, look at this being the bottom line, you can see that it had this square, this piece, this piece. So it was really two different types, two heights, this and this and this. And that's really all it took. And when they cut it and rotated it, that's what happened. So it's a thing of being able to take a board and undo what's been done to it. And that's what makes a chaos board so great, is because, so the trick with a chaos board is you take all your scraps and you kind of divvy them up and you put them together so that you're creating 3 boards that are basically the same width. You don't care about how long they are, as long as they're the same width, because eventually you're going to cut across the width after the first cut. So after the first cut, when you cut across the width, now you've got all these pieces with the same width, and you make 3 boards again, and you mix them up and you turn them around and you flip them upside down, and then you cut those again and you interchange those. And then if you want to get really fun with it, you start cutting on the diagonals and moving the pieces diagonally around. And what happens is, because you might be even cutting at one point, you may be cutting just even random thicknesses because the width is going to keep it all together. You end up with these little slices, or you end up, I mean, if you think about, you know, so this is a piece of the board, right? So if I use this in a scrap board, you're going to have horizontal pieces in it. Or if I cut it at a 45-degree angle and put them back to back and remake the square, they're going to be on a diagonal. And that's, you know, something I would like to do like in a 201 class, but, you know, time, you know, there'll be time for that. Are there any questions about, you know, how I did it, or other stuff you guys want to know about?
I just want to know when you're doing the next one so I can sign up.
Well, we have to be able to have more than 2 people in the studio at one time. That, you know, it's just a thing of the virus, and
Yeah.
but yeah. So
Looks like a lot of fun. I mean, you made it look simple, but it's going to be a learning curve, and I'm excited to start whenever we get back to, you know, doing stuff.
well, you know, it's been great because the 6 people who have built, you know, you sort of come in with a picture of what you want, and then I help you dissect it.
Okay.
And all 6 people said to me after the first glue up, this isn't what I want. This doesn't look like what I want. And I'm like, no, you have to trust me. You know, we're going to get there in the next cut. Or for some people, it's 3 cuts. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, when I'm doing a chaos board, I've kind of come to the conclusion that beyond 8 cuts, it just doesn't, I think it's
chaotic.
how many times you shuffle cards is like 6. You know, it doesn't get any better. It doesn't,
Yeah.
it doesn't get any weirder, other than if you're doing angles. Then you can get in, but you also have to remember you've got to start really big, because every cut, well, I do use, I bring a smaller, I use an 80 tooth, it's it's 1/32 less than an eighth. It's a slightly thinner blade. You know, eventually I'll probably I'll cut mine on a bandsaw, just because that is the least amount of waste. Because you always, you know, on a regular saw blade, you lose 1/8 of an inch for every cut. So, you know, you're making a fine sawdust pile.
Cathy, I do have a question, and you hit upon it earlier, or we went over it. What if you do make a cutting board that's got some glue up gaps? Is there any way to salvage that?
Yeah,
Oh.
you can, I mean, there's many different ways. One is you can basically route the piece out and put in another piece. If it's, I mean, you can use epoxy. The only thing I would say that is not a great idea about epoxy is you really don't want a knife going on a big epoxy surface, because it's just like cutting plastic. Okay, so it's gonna mar it. So I would, if it were my board, I would, depending on how deep it was, if it wasn't all the way through, I might go to the CNC and have it cut something for me, and then have it, you know, you tell it to cut the outer and then cut the inner, and so then you can do an inlay. Like,
Okay.
I've done inlay boards before. A lot of people say the inlay boards, you know, shouldn't really be used as cutting boards. I don't know. I mean, if I had I made an inlay board of my logo, and I don't want to cut on the inlay. I cut on the other side, you know, and then I put the inlay side up when I just want to look at it. Because it's also just a face grain board, so yeah, so it's, you know, but, you know, hopefully, you know, you'll catch it when you're doing the glue up, when you're looking for that line. And, you know, I mean, not that you really want to do too much glue, but too much is better than too little. And you can also, you know, use a chisel and just zip it right down the face of the board and take the glue off if you have a lot of glue. Some people actually, when they do the glue up, they then immediately take a wet rag to it and wipe the glue off. You know, and there's different schools of thought about whether, you know, you should do that or not, if it's putting glue in the pores, you know, and I'm just like, I just like, you know, my little piece of plastic. And most of the time, you know, when you're taking the class, you're probably not going to come in, or, you know, you may be like, especially at the end of the first day is very long, and it's a lot of mental gyrations, and people don't want to wait a half an hour to scrape the glue down. They're like, I'll just deal with it, you know, and we can use, you know, we can use the planer, you know, to make quick work of it. Unless, I mean, a lot of people say no to an ingrain board. What I do is I do put ingrain boards through my planer, but what I do is on the leading edge and trailing edge, I glue up an extra piece of wood. So to be a sacrificial piece of wood, because if you don't, it tears out. So, and I take maybe a 32nd of an inch off in each pass. So, you know, or I make one of my kids sand it. I'm totally into child labor.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, yeah.
Oh, cool.
Any other questions?
Thank you. That was fantastic.
You're welcome.
It was.
Anytime.
It was.
So go, you know, go out to Pinterest or whatever and start looking at cutting board patterns. If you want to email them to me, you know, I can tell you how to break it down. Once you've seen a few broken down, then you'll start to be able to break them down yourself. And then also, once you see them broken down, then your ability to dream them up. Like I have one that has pinwheels in it. And, you know, it's just a series of 45-degree angle cuts. And if you put two 45s together and then you flip it on its side, then it can look like a pinwheel. And, you know, that just mesmerizes people. They're just like, you know, they think you cut it all up in little itty bitty pieces and glue them together one at a time. And I'm like, you can think that all you want, buddy. Fine with me. So, yeah. But yeah.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you very much for doing that. I know it's a tough format to.
Yeah, but it's, you know, I think it's, you know, it's hard to do, you know, for some people to commit, you know, 4 days or 4 nights or a night a week. And, you know, this may give you enough information where you're willing to try it yourself. I mean, the key really, the crucial key, you know, in doing all of this is having the square wood. If those 3 faces aren't square, and the reason I don't square the 4th face off is that's going to be leftover, and I want as much leftover as I can get, because maybe I can trim it in such a way. Plywood, I do get rid of plywood scraps, or I burn them, you know, 2x4s, yes. This stuff, it has to be like those little pieces when I was cutting the edges. Those I did throw away, but everything else I keep and I use some other way. Like I'm gonna start doing some, so I have a lot of stuff left over from the chaos boards I used to make the knife block. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually make some more knife blocks and inlay the chaos board into the knife block.
Oh, fun.
That'll be very neat.
Yeah, I think it'll look really, really, really cool. And it's really easy to do if you think about, you know, the knife block is a square, and then you put it at an angle and cut a dado in it on the table saw that just fits that piece, and then you just lay the piece in and glue it in.
It'll be cool to see.
Well, as you can see, my kids have cut my hair, so, you know, that's how I lost it.
I know my hair, I've got about 2 inches of roots. I think it was January.
Yep, no, I let my kids cut mine. So,
Wow.
and they just
Thank you,
cutting,
Cathy.
Yeah,
cutting,
thank
And cutting left, right. I know I have to do my husband's, and you know, he keeps asking me. I'm like, I really just don't think you understand what you're asking here. He will.
my husband, he's never gonna ask again. So
Right.
Kevin's sitting there going, no way, not me.
Dude.
okay, see you guys.
All right.
A lot
All
of
right.
fun. Thanks,
Thank
Cathy.
you.
Bye, Kevin. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Cathy.
Bye.